Hi everyone, it's Mrs. McGeehan here to walk you through what an emulation looks like for our fine line analyses. I am going to be working today with a passage that you saw earlier this week. So I'll read this passage for you once again so you have it in mind. The original passage reads, "And in her ears the little seashells, the thimble radios tamped tight, and an electronic ocean of sound, of music and talk and music and talk, coming in on the shore of her unsleeping mind." The room was indeed empty. Every night the waves came in and bore her off on their great tides of sound, floating her wide-eyed toward morning. So I wanted to walk you through the parts of my emulation that you're going to see in your work today. You can see that right under the original passage, I have all of my notes from my passage study here. I didn't include these notes for you to look at yesterday because I wanted you to look at them in the context of the emulation today. So I would ask that you take some time to walk through my notes for this passage study of this passage and compare my notes to the notes that you took in your passage study for this passage in your work earlier on the week. Again, comparing what I saw that maybe you didn't see, and vice versa. What did you maybe see that I didn't see? So you can see that my passage study is rather lengthy. Again, you want to mine the line, as I've been saying all week. You really want to try to exhaust the passage and make sure that you're looking for each and every move that Bradbury is making within your passages. I copied and pasted the original passage down here once again so that I could kind of see it at the top of my page and know what I was working with. For your purposes, I outlined my thought process here. When I originally sat down to think about this passage, I thought first about kind of the whole metaphor of the ocean in this passage. And so I started there with the metaphor, and I thought, can I talk about the passing of time, or maybe time taking someone towards death? And so you can kind of see my initial notes of towards death and darkness at the end of the passage. But then I couldn't quite decide where the clock would be in a room. The passage begins and in, and I wasn't quite sure where I was going to put my clock if I had to start the passage that way. I was thinking, okay, well, instead of waves, it could be the ticking. I was sort of envisioning kind of this huge metaphoric, these big hands, these metaphoric hands that almost physically move a person or push a person towards death. Again, kind of making the connection between the hands of a clock and even like the image of the hands of the Grim Reaper or death kind of coming to take someone. So I thought on that metaphor for a while and tried to kind of take it for a test drive, so to speak, and see where or how or if I could make it work within an emulation for this passage. I kind of then drifted onto the idea of thoughts. Well, can I think about thoughts maybe being overwhelming, that we can't escape our thoughts sometimes? And then that sort of took me to the idea of anxiety and paranoia. And then, as you'll see in my emulation, I ultimately landed on and went with the idea of someone suffering from PTSD. As I thought about PTSD, very quickly then, this was sort of my aha moment. Very quickly then, I could conceive of and kind of envision how this passage could play out with a war or battle metaphor. So I kind of started to dig in from there and just started working with the passage from there. So I sort of work my way chronologically from the start of the passage to the end of the passage. I included here for you sort of my working emulation so that you could see reflected my thought processes as I worked. So if you read through this, you'll see Where I have a slash, those were the words that I had kind of toyed with. So I was sure to just leave them there so you could kind of follow my thought process. And then I ultimately, in some places, underlined and bolded the ones that I went with, or you can just see the end result down here. So I wanted to make sure that as students, you could sort of see the evolution of my emulation and sort of the actual thought process that I went through while I was working with this passage to create my emulation. So ultimately, you'll see from the original passage, again, just to remind you of how that read, and in her ears the little seashells, the thimble radios tamped tight, and an electronic ocean of sound, of music and talk coming in on the shore of her unsleeping mind. The room was indeed empty. Every night the waves came in and bore her off on their great tides of sound, floating her wide-eyed toward morning. And I'll read for you then my final emulation so that you have a sense for what it sounds like right next to that original passage. And in his head, the readied battalion, the eager troops at attention, and a defeating siege of angst, of fear and death, and fear and death, pelting down on the battleground of his beleaguered mind. He was indeed wounded. Every morning the battery trudged in and wore him down with its immense barrage of thought, beating him, war-torn, toward darkness. So you can take some time to kind of compare my passage with Bradbury's original if you wish. But before I go, I also wanted to point you in the direction of my explication. This is what you will do after or during, depending on how your brain sort of works and your processes work. This is what you will do perhaps during and after, both, while you're creating your emulation passage. An explication is really just a detailed explanation. And so what you'll see me doing here is just kind of walking you or walking my reader through the decisions that I ultimately made as the writer. And again, these decisions are informed by the original passage. So it's sort of a conversation about how the choices I made within my emulation passage are reflective of the choices that Bradbury made within his original passage. So once again, I would ask that you kind of read your way down through my explication, noting that this is precisely what you will have to do, and in this detail for your own emulation passage. And then I know I mentioned this to some of you, I just included my timeline here for when I did this passage. I started at about 10:10. I got distracted and texted my classes at about 10:16. I responded to a few text messages. So probably around 10:20 is when I really started in earnest with my emulation, and I ended at about 11:25. So you can see that it took me about an hour, and that was an hour just to do my actual emulation. That did not include time to kind of go back and write my explication. So just to give you a sense for how long this took me, it may take you about the same, it may take you a little less, and maybe it might take you a little more if this is your first time doing one. I also just included another example down here for you to see in case you want one more emulation and kind of the evolution of an emulation to see. So I included here an original passage. I was inspired to try this passage because of a student example that I read, and I liked where the student was going with it, but I just didn't think she really nailed it. And so I thought to myself, I think I can do this one. And so I just wanted to play around with it a little bit. And that is, this is my end product then that you can see. So again, just one more example. In the remainder of your work today, I'm going to have you checking out another example as well for one of the other passages that we took a look at earlier in the week. I hope that this is helpful. If you have any questions as you're working on your emulation passages for your fine line for the practice this week or in earnest next week, just let me know. If you would like me to kind of take a look at your process or what you have so far, you can always check in with me and just say, am I on the right track? All right, I hope you're all well. Take care.